So hello everyone, and thank you for coming to the Chimera Festival run science panel about the people who made me look much more clever than I am for the science behind my new book, Goldilocks, over here, available now from all good retailers. Sly plug. But yeah, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of the panelists. And so first up, we have Heidi DeBlock, Dr. Heidi DeBlock, who is a critical care physician and visiting research scientist at NASA in the Cardiovascular and Vision Laboratory. And then we have Dr. Sinead Collins, who is an evolutionary biologist who runs a lab that looks at algae in the context of climate change at the University of Edinburgh. And then we have Dr. Peta Freestone, who is also known as the young adult author PM Freestone by their books. And in their PhD, they investigated the sociology of public health and infectious diseases. So they're here with their PhD hat on. So when I sold this book, I realized that I know nothing about science whatsoever. And yet I had somehow signed on to do a book that required a lot of science. And so through various methods, I realized Sinead was basically Naomi, but not an astronaut. And then through my agent's assistant, Liza, I was able to meet Heidi and ask questions about what happens to the human body in space, and some very specific questions that I can't talk about because they're spoilers. And then I've known Peta for years and asked lots of questions about infectious diseases, which means I now know too much about what's going on in the world. So I've given you all a very brief intro of the three of you, but could you go and give a slightly longer overview of what your job and area of expertise is? Start with Heidi.
Hi. Hello from Portland, Maine in the United States. I actually studied astrophysics in college and then went to medical school, needed a job, and found my way to NASA in the cardiovascular physiology lab in 1990 as a student, and everything clicked, and I've been going back ever since and doing all sorts of fun things. From about 95 to 2003, I was involved in a very long research project that got me to a lot of the shuttle landings. So that, and you can see behind me the shuttle landing. To me, it's all about landing, not about launch. And we study the cardiovascular physiology that the effects to our cardiovascular system in space, as well as we've taken on a lot of the vision problems that the astronauts are having now and trying to figure that out. So I initially started in the shuttle days, looking forward to the International Space Station. Now we're on the ISS and looking forward to even longer duration orbit towards Mars. My day job is as an intensive care unit physician and hospitalist now while I'm here in Maine, and taking care of critically ill patients.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Heidi. And Sinead.
I'm Sinead Collins. I do experimental evolution with microbes, and that's just a fancy way of saying I study evolution by watching it in real time. And microbes are great for doing that because they reproduce super quickly and have these huge population sizes. And you've all seen evolution in real time, so antibiotic resistance is evolution in real time. I don't study antibiotics though, I study phytoplankton, so these unicellular algae that live in water. And the reason I find them exciting, actually initially I found them exciting for very, very intricate, tiny physiological reasons, but eventually I realized that they make half the oxygen on the planet and are really important to things like carbon sinks in the ocean. And when we want to project what's going to happen in the future, the not too distant future in the world, we need to know what the oceans are doing. And these tiny organisms, these phytoplankton, they act as adapter plugs between the biological and sort of biogeochemical, for lack of a better term, world. And that's why I find them exciting. What I do is I do lots of experiments in the lab. I grow hundreds or thousands of populations of tiny phytoplankton, and I stress them out in different ways, either making them grow in like a high CO2 world or a low pH world or a world where everything is going wrong. And then I look for general principles and rules that might allow us to project that into oceans and lakes and whatnot. So I essentially do something slightly better than looking into a crystal ball. Although often it does feel like I am really just trying to make a big algae crystal ball in my lab. And this was my first time actually working on a sci-fi anything, and it was really, really fun.
And Peta.
So I am kind of an academic mongrel. I've got a bunch of different degrees at the undergrad and postgrad coursework level that basically made me a professional student for a while, from archaeology to educational policy. But what's relevant here is that my PhD is in global health. It was very multidisciplinary, and in lay terms, I looked at how we can better support scientists who are trying to create innovations for diseases of infectious diseases, and I focus specifically on diseases of poverty. So tuberculosis vaccines was my specific area, but obviously had to look at a lot of the underpinnings, the social underpinnings of infectious diseases around the world, and I think we're seeing that play out again now. These days, though, I'm quite passionate about science communication, so I'm an author on one side, but with my Dr. Freestone hat on, I work with universities around the world, helping earlier career academics, I suppose, more easily, more productively, and more effectively communicate their findings in the various ways that they need to. So.
Cool. So yeah, this is my illustrious panel. And so my next question is, how did you find the experience of being asked to think of your job funneled through a science fiction novel set in the near future? Especially considering most of you didn't really know the big picture of the book. So I was in the process of frantically writing it to deadline. So whoever wants to start.
I was given quite a quick task, which I thought was a lot of fun. I don't want to spoil it too much, but
no, it's hard to talk around it. It was about
very
a
difficult to
specific
talk
thing.
around this.
Yeah.
I had to come up with a quick something that might be life-threatening that we could handle very quickly on a space station and in master. And so that was sort of fun because that drew in my critical care knowledge. But then there was all of the physiology and the fun physiology of you having gravity on part of the station and microgravity at the center of the station, and the physiologic changes on the body as the characters were going back and forth, and everything that came into that. So I got to draw on not just the cardiovascular physiology aspects, but what happens to my patients in bed, and what can we give them that might be life-threatening and sort of fun.
Because they go together, life-threatening.
Yeah, so we can fix it.
Yeah.
I've never done anything like that before. It was great.
Yeah.
Sure, I can tackle that.
Yeah.
I loved it. I was also given this mission, so I guess I have to preface this with part of my job that I really love is that I get to play MacGyver all the time. So one of the things I like to do is do experiments that no one thinks I can do, and so things I've done include making tiny cages for phytoplankton and suspending them in fjords, or doing experiments where I have like 96 environments, so like thousands of populations of algae growing in tiny volumes, and things like that. So when Laura said, how would you grow algae on a spaceship? I was like, oh yes. So I really enjoyed that because it let me just let my imagination run quite wild. But with tech that was very close to tech I could already understand. So it was a big challenge because it wasn't like you can have any tech you want, just replicate everything and it will happen. I had to actually think about what I thought could happen in 30, 50, 60 years, something like that. So that was incredibly fun.
Yeah.
I also just enjoyed watching algae take center stage a little bit. Watching pond scum get all the attention I think it deserves.
Yeah, I am drinking spirulina for the record. It's the innocent juice that has a little bit of spirulina in it. Yeah. Peta.
Yeah, I think I was kind of brought in, I guess earlier on, we were imagining you know, this near future world and the kind of things that might be plausible in it to, I guess, necessitate a kind of a mission like what begins at the start of Goldilocks. No spoilers. And a lot of that is twining together both what is happening in society with where science is at. And I always see science as completely enmeshed or inextricable from society, from politics, from economics, from belief systems and worldviews. So we like to sometimes think of it as this nice sterile thing over there that is facts and facts only, but they're entwined. So I suppose we had discussions around that to start with, including, you know, the different diseases that could and do ravage the future world.
So Heidi, you're on the front line of COVID-19 right now, and Peta, you told me how you expected things to go in early February, and you were completely right, unfortunately. And Sinead, you're in regular contact with the infectious disease researchers at the University of Edinburgh. So how has it been for you three navigating this experience while knowing so much about the science? Does being armed with the knowledge help, or is it sometimes overwhelming?
I think it can get frustrating. I think, you know, in early February, I was at the Society of Critical Care Medicine meetings, and everybody was already talking about this, and we were planning as far as critical care aspects and taking care of these patients in the intensive care unit and what it would take and what people were learning already from China. And that is completely different than what's actually happening now. And I think and I say frustrating because the science of this has evolved so quickly, and we've had to figure this out so quickly that medically, things that we may have been doing 6 weeks ago changed 5 weeks ago. And things that we were doing 2 weeks ago have changed today. And I get no less than about 30 emails a day with updates and new research that's gone on in the bench and in the patients on how to take care of these patients and what to do for these patients. So you have to, it's somebody likened it to going to medical school again. It's complete new education on a daily basis. It's so difficult to keep up with, and you just go to bed at night and have COVID dreams. I've had a few COVID dreams.
I bet, yes.
It's very difficult to keep up with. It's in such flux.
I mean, I guess you kind of pointed out, I don't study anything to do with COVID. So my first reaction or first priority was actually getting out of the way of people in my department who could use resources that I was perhaps standing in the way of as this wave hit, which was quite scary. I've also, as a climate change scientist, been watching the way epidemiologists are catching flack from all sides, and I feel for them. That's sort of, I think, part of being a scientist that's incredibly frustrating is watching a preventable disaster happen. And so the parallels between scientists warning about climate change and scientists warning about COVID-19 are striking. Of course, COVID-19 has been so much faster. So there is that parallel. But in terms of the actual pandemic, I think I'm not sure understanding it better helps when what you're doing is sitting at home and trying to keep your lab afloat. I guess you feel, I don't feel particularly hard done by being at home. So I'm trying quite hard to stay out of the way and support my colleagues who can actually do something to move as fast as they can. And that's sort of everything from freeing up lab supplies to doing extra grading and whatnot. So honestly, I haven't had that much time to think about the pandemic, right? I think those of us who are trying to clear space for everyone else are run off our feet doing the extra stuff around the edges to free them up.
That's still important.
Needs doing.
I think for me, the most frustrating thing about it has been not just from a political side of things in the UK, but just seeing how information and misinformation was going to play out in this from the very start, especially with the general public. And while I might have the knowledge that I do, and I could put certain things in place from the very beginning that protect me, also as, you know, someone who has underlying conditions, and I knew what those underlying conditions were because I could interrogate the data that was available rather than just what the media told me from the start. So I was able to protect myself without, for instance, having to wait for a letter from the NHS. So that in itself was a beneficial thing to be able to do. But I suppose what the frustrating thing is how terribly misinformed or not sufficiently informed the general public was along the way. There was all the policy things and the global health things as well, but I think that's what's been the most frustrating, speaking to people who I would think would be thinking about this in a different way and perhaps have a different approach, and just realizing, even among my friends who are, you know, very intelligent and well educated in other areas, how much they're relying on I guess faulty information. And obviously, as Heidi was saying, the situation is rapidly changing, so it's not just that information changes, but it's that they can't even fathom why information would change and things like that. So yeah, I've been having to at different times limit my consumption of information and interaction and talk about the pandemic, because I can see it playing out. It has played out before in different ways. It will play out again, and it does get frustrating.
Yeah, definitely. So this is my question. So Sinead, a lot of what you do in the lab and the classes that you teach look at the ramifications of climate change and projections to the future. Can you speak a little bit about that and what sort of future you predict for us at present? And obviously, Peta and Heidi, you're welcome to chime in after that with any thoughts on climate change. And it's backwards, but I'm wearing my There Is No Planet B t-shirt today.
It's not backwards, I don't think.
Is it not?
No.
Okay, cool. It looks backwards to me. I don't know why.
I mean, I think, so thinking about the sort of world we see going forward, I think the science has been clear for decades. Like, I like to say that the science side of climate change, which is one of the things I study, was clear when I started kindergarten, right? And I'm now comfortably into my 40s. And so the climate scientists today are really dotting I's and crossing T's on the science. It's something that needs to be solved politically. We know the science, that we know as much science as we need to make decisions at this point. And we can keep coming up with more details and refining those. And I think that's important, especially when it comes to innovating solutions. But watching this pandemic play out has been really informative for me, in that you can see that there are places that have taken rapid and effective action. And there have been places that have, in the face of really, really horrible death tolls, still fail to take action. When there are clear patterns of things that can mitigate the crisis. And so I think I've been focusing much more on how I think this can be mobilized to get people to care more about climate change, because now they can imagine the scale of disruption that climate scientists are talking about when we say things are going to get worse. This is the scale of worse we're talking about. It's not sort of just perhaps not getting to go on a holiday one year. It's sort of these repeated disasters that will really affect a lot of lives. That's not the most cheery answer, I guess.
I don't know if there's a cheery climate change answer at present.
It's a cheery climate change answer. I think my answer to all the climate change questions has become the science has been clear forever at this point. And it's really about pushing for political action. And we don't need more science if we don't listen to the scientists. Hopefully other people have things to say on this one.
Oh, yeah. I disagree, Sinead. I mean, even from a global health and a public health perspective, we've, been seeing for decades, even the areas that tropical diseases now move into, like the places we have dengue fever and malaria that we didn't even 10 or 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago. It's very clear that things are changing and not for the better in that way, especially in terms of the public health ramifications and how that is entwined with global poverty levels and the people who will be most affected as climate change impacts, start to or continue to be felt around the world.
Mm.
I mean, one of the things we've done this year when we could still go and gather in crowds was there were on the climate change marches on Friday. I mean, I think on the Fridays, we brought like our MSc class to a climate change march. I really felt the best thing we could do in training those up and coming scientists was have them like carry snacks for 7-year-olds who were marching. And I think that's where I see some hope, is that there's now this solidarity between these really young climate activists and climate scientists. And so you're getting this intergenerational link that I think has a potential to be quite strong and quite powerful.
Yeah, and I've heard, from several scientists that basically because of the climate change disruption and because of how we're interacting with nature, like these zootropic diseases, like this is not going to be the only one. This can easily keep happening if we keep encroaching, on places we shouldn't, if, our lifestyle doesn't change and we don't figure out how to.
This is the third leap, like in the last couple of decades of a coronavirus, just a coronavirus we're talking about. So it's even thinking about this as something new and.
Yeah. No, it's not. Definitely not. No. So we've now all been self-isolating for about 2 months now, a little more than 2 months. Though all of us on the panel have been working from home, some of us very intensely. How have you coped with isolation, and has any knowledge from your job helped or hindered? Like Sinead, I know you've been on research trips to Antarctica, and Peta, you've been on remote archaeological digs, for example.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you start, Peta? I want to hear about I want to hear about these remote digs.
Yeah. I've been various places. I've been stranded on Easter Island in a typhoon, and I've been, working for a couple of months at a time on excavations in the Yucatan down in Central America, where, the nearest town is 4 hours drive and a truck away over a bumpy kind of logging track. So I've done, kind of some out of the way things where you get, a 30-second army shower a day and etc. But I think some of the things that have come into play since I've been on lockdown that are similar to those times are focusing on both things that are very immediate and things that are very distant. I always have trouble with the medium term, I think, when I'm under a stress like this. So I can find comfort in everyday routines. We know everyone's posting their sourdough and their banana bread all over Instagram, this kind of small kind of microcosm of control that you have with your everyday routines, and seeing what pleasure you can get out of the things that you can still do, and how that connects you to others, and how that might even connect you to the world. I mean, there's an argument that making things with your hands, especially as office workers, can be comforting. And then I suppose I focus on the very long term and just have hope for that, make 5-year plans in a hopeful way. But I find that anything beyond the daily time, so looking forward to that 30-second camp shower, or my beans and rice for dinner because I'm so hungry because I've been in the field, or one day when I graduate from my PhD, as in back then, that's what I was thinking. I find that middle ground difficult, so I try and compartmentalize that and keep that a bit separate.
Mm.
I'll let Sinead go next.
I mean, I've only done one trip to the Antarctic, but I have done a few field seasons, and there's a lot that's quite similar. Part of it is when fieldwork can be quite intense, as I'm sure Peta knows, and one of the rules I have during fieldwork is I never make decisions during fieldwork. I write myself directions and I follow them. Because any brilliant idea I come up with on like day 20 of no sleep is probably not as brilliant as it feels right in the moment. So I've done a pretty good job of saying this is what I'm going to do and not questioning it halfway through when it feels stupid or useless, which I think comes from field work. And I was talking about this with Laura last week. When you do field work, there's always this point after halfway, but before 3/4, which I just think of as the lull. And it doesn't matter how long field work is, it's always at that point. And during the lull, everything is super hard and everyone you work with is out to get you. And it's so predictable that when you plan your field work, you like plan a party for this time to stop everyone going nuts. And I kind of realized that right now I'm in this lull. And even being able to name that and realize that it wasn't actually that I was going crazy. It was just this very predictable, just past the perceived center of something that's intrinsically difficult was really useful to me, because then I also know what comes next and how to get through it and things like that. But yeah, a lot of it is just focusing on what's right in front of you. I find helps a lot. And there is something enjoyable about having a small field of vision. Like, one of the best New Year's Eves I've ever spent was by myself overnight in a lab on a ship. And I was filtering water for something like 11 hours. And it was overnight, so everyone else was asleep. And I just listened to David Bowie for 11 hours and filtered water and watched icebergs go by. And it's like not a complete existence. You can't live on that forever. But you can enjoy how simple things are for that moment. And I think that's what I've been trying to focus on my better days. That's the take I'm able to deal with lockdown. Because we're 2 people and 2 cats in 2 rooms. So it's pretty much like it's very similar to being on a ship in that sense.
I was going to say, I just completely agree on the lull and the what happens when you go on field work. Someone said to me, dealing with the lockdown and dealing with the idea of a pandemic in general is kind of like going through the different stages of grief. And I would agree with that, and you can bounce around in them. But I relate to what you're saying, Sinead, about the going through the different stages when you're on field work. Like, you first get there and a lot of the time you're like, oh, and this thing didn't work, and didn't such and such bring that equipment? You needed to bring that equipment. Where is my theodolite? You know, like, and then you kind of settle into it and you get a bit cocky. You're like, yeah, I can handle this. I got my machete. I'm going through the jungle. Nothing's going to get me. And then you're like, wow, that was so arrogant. And that's when you start to get going downhill into that lull and get cranky with everyone on your team. And then everyone knows they're going to be leaving. So they get this whole like, oh, I miss you. I miss this place, etc. And I think that's the one thing why I've been doing the very everyday stuff and then the very long-term stuff and not being able to look at the middle part, because I don't know when the end of this field trip is.
So I get to go to work every day. I get to go interact with humans. And so that hasn't really changed for me, but there's 2 kinds of isolation that we do experience, and that is we don't allow patients' families into the hospital. So our patients are there very much alone. And so you are now their family, and you're communicating with their family, and you have to be the great communicator who goes between the patient and the family, who they can speak over the phone. We can FaceTime every now and then, but that the our patients are very much isolated, and it's not good for them at all. They need that you can touch and you can go in and chat as much as you can in and out of the rooms all day long, but it's just not the same as having family members there. And so that's very difficult. We have had a couple of deaths, and not from COVID that I've cared for, but patients who have died, and we do allow now 1 family member into the rooms, but that only changed about 2 weeks ago. And so it's a different kind of isolation that I get to watch and be part of and try to help our patients through. And can I make a jump also to the isolation in space?
Yes.
Okay.
I know people keep sending me little paragraphs of like the women in isolation being like, how did you know?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So the isolation in space is interesting. You're on the ISS, you only up with 3 to 5 people, and for the planned Mars, or well, people are thinking about going to Mars, would only be 4 or 5 people. Well, initially thinking about a crew of 7, but now a crew of 4 or 5. Same for going back to the moon. So, it's interesting how the dynamics of human interaction work as time goes on in these space analogs and up on the ISS. But the concern, and a lot of big study, the studies now of observing how the crews manage and work in the ISS and the space analogs like the Human Exploration Research Analog at NASA, and how it sort of doesn't fall apart, but people become more independent with time rather than cohesive as a group with time, and how that group is going to interact with each other because they are very much isolated. And isolation is one of the key aspects that the Human Research Project is working on, is how are we going to deal with isolation in space for all that time going to Mars. Mm-hmm. That said, one of the biggest concerns that we can't really set up an experiment for on Earth is that when you're in between, and Sinead was talking about that, Sinead and Peter were both saying, yeah, that in-between period, it's like, okay, well, I just left Earth and, well, there's Mars. I'm in between. But as I look back to Earth, I see a speck. And as I look forward to Mars, I see a speck. And I belong to no one and can't see my future or my past. And the concern is there's going to be overwhelming sense of despair to potential psychosis. So that's just going to have to play out because no one knows how that's going to work.
Yeah, I saw in part of my research there was an experiment where I think they sent people to somewhere remote in Hawaii, and they had no contact with the outside world for a year, and it was a experiment, like they got it as close to Mars as it could be, and they weren't allowed. There were about 5 people or 6 people, and they all kept separate blogs. They wouldn't, like, the other people couldn't read them. So I went through and I read all 6 of them, and it was really interesting because you know that they're censoring themselves because it's going to go public, but you'd still see like the different focuses, what they chose to write about, what they were interested in, what annoyed them, and where they disagreed, and I found that really fascinating.
It is very fascinating, and it's everybody's personality is different, and selecting crews for this is going to be very interesting because you're going to have to get that person who can be a leader when they need to be, but back off when the time comes also. Mm-hmm. And so that, if you get a whole bunch of type A's and put them in a box on the way to Mars, bad things are going to happen.
It's not going to work. And I think too, like, you can think how you react under pressure, but if you're under that much pressure, you might not react how you think you would too.
Absolutely. And some of the pressure in what we're concerned with in the Human Research Project is not just the isolation, but the autonomy that the astronauts are going to have to take, because you're going to have a lag of communication of up to 40 minutes. So if something goes wrong, you're going to have to be able to take care of it and think through this and do what's right without any help from mission control.
Mm-hmm. So kind of following on to that, they're going to be spending potentially months in microgravity as they go to Mars, unless they figure out gravity. Like I cheated and did a gravity ring in Goldilocks to get around a lot of the things I'm going to ask you, because there's a lot of problems that come about when you put the human body, which is designed to be in 1G, in microgravity. So could you tell us some of the weird and horrible things that happen when we go into space for a long time? And I know John bought a ticket, but I don't know if he's in here.
I don't see John on. I was hoping that John Charles, who's a dear friend and my first lab director, would be on. If you're on, John, just unmute yourself. But John was my first lab director and just retired as the head of human research for NASA. So he's the be all and end all.
I got to ask him some questions too.
Yeah, he actually is one of the foremost space physiologists in the world. We are designed, obviously, we live in 1G, our body is 1G, and you put us up into microgravity and literally every system breaks. Everything changes. In your cardiovascular system, things change, our hearts change in their shape a little bit, our electrical activity of our heart changes a little bit, our hemodynamics change, our blood pressure, how we react to blood pressure, how our brain regulates our blood pressure changes, our lungs change, and where the blood flow in our lungs is and where the oxygen in the air goes to in our lungs change. Our guts, this is sort of fun fact, our guts slow down a bit when we're up in space, so the astronauts get a bit of constipation. And that also changes how we metabolize our medications. So if you take a medication and your gut's a little slower, you may absorb more of it. And the metabolism of that drug in your liver can slow down also. And so it's not just like you can sort of take your 2 Tylenol up in space. You sort of have to be careful about how you're going to metabolize it. Of course, we leach bone and the calcium from our bone up in space because we're not doing weight-bearing exercise. So we lose bone and muscle mass. Even if you're on the treadmill every day and you're bungee down to that treadmill, you're only supporting about 75 to 80% of your weight. So it's not full weight-bearing exercise. So that's a problem. And if you're leaching calcium from your bones, the way we rid extra calcium out of our body is through our urinary tract, and we pee it off. And so that can create kidney stones. So we have to be careful of kidney stones in the astronauts. Now there's a whole bunch of vision changes that the astronauts are noting on long duration space flight. And that has got us looking at the brain and how the morphology of the brain and the shape of the brain and the fluid of the brain all change as a result of spaceflight. And there's some cognition issues also. Is there a cognitive decline in spaceflight? And so we're looking at all that. You want to be able to land on Mars and get off and be fresh and lovely. You don't want to, jump down and get a broken bone or not be thinking straight or having your blood pressure tank. So there's everything in the world is changing in our bodies as we go up into space. What we're looking at with these long duration space flight now, with these 1-year missions, is that these changes happen and you start seeing the system break, and do they level off or do things just keep getting worse? And what we're seeing is, things change and then they sort of level off, and that's what you want to be able to see. There's a couple things that we won't be able to check for, and that is one of the psychological aspects of spaceflight.
That was fascinating. I knew most of that, but not all of that, so that was cool. So Peta, can you share a little bit about how you think social policy could best react to a crisis such as COVID-19? How do you think we should be thinking about and preparing for the next pandemic in a way that doesn't simply exacerbate existing inequalities? This is basically your jam. It's what your PhD was on.
You could ask the UK government to take a look at the outcomes of the several pandemic crisis tests that they ran for a start. So there's obviously no easy answer to this other than socialism, but there are so many different layers to what happens in a pandemic. There are all of the things that people on the front line like Heidi deal with, that are just that are most importantly trying to save people's lives on the front line. But then there is everything from, like we've seen in the UK, I'm not sure how it's been in the States, but with the PPE situation has been a supply, a logistics, an economic thing, a policy thing, to protect those people in the front line, and it just keeps extrapolating out from there. So I think if you're interested in this kind of thing, a really interesting read is Peter Pyatt's autobiography. It's a little bit dated now, but he's the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He was on the team that discovered Ebola many decades ago, and then worked at the multilateral level on HIV. And he kind of takes you through all of the different things that happen from the discovery of a disease through to what happens at that geopolitical level, and what the different hold-ups and gatekeeping and everything are. And I have a lot of respect for him, and it's a good read. It's a well-written book. So if you're interested in it, I'd check that out. It's called No Time to Lose, and I think there's a key in the title there, and we've seen that with COVID as well. So really, pandemic preparedness, emphasis on preparedness, and actually investing in these things before they happen, as we've seen with some of the countries around the world that have dealt more effectively with outbreaks of COVID-19, will be the key thing to policies. And that will go right back down to education as well, like Sinead was talking about, even with climate change from a very young age. My frustrations, for instance, with people not being able to access, as in everyday public people being able to access accurate scientific information when something like this happens, so that they know how to protect themselves and their families. So it's everything from the ground up. But yeah, essentially, I don't see a way around at this point with the way that our global system works, other than the state having a greater investment role, because it's not going to be solved by. I work on product development partnerships for innovations for infectious diseases, and what they're about is bringing academia and government together with big pharmaceuticals and medical technology companies. And what we see time and time again is the risk needs to be taken by the public sector initially to develop those interventions usually, and then they go on to be scaled up by big pharmaceutical companies. So on every level I see a role for the state still, and that's my policy recommendation, that you just can't leave it to the free market.
Yeah.
Can I jump in with something there, Laura? Yeah, so this really, I think, has a good climate change parallel, which is this idea that we're trying to shift responsibility to individual people to solve these giant problems that require being solved by governments. For instance, during the COVID crisis, CO2 emissions have gone down. The best estimate I was able to get from the International Energy Agency is that they're down by about 8%. So let's just put that in perspective. The entire world has basically stopped, right? All individual citizens, if we were to continue doing this, this is what we would need to do every single year to meet our climate goals, right? So this is not something that can be solved by the action of individual people doing their thing. And individual action is important for a lot of reasons, but if we're going to decrease carbon emissions by 8% every year, so that's what COVID has done, 8% maybe, I think we're not going to do it by people cycling or recycling or taking staycations voluntarily. It actually needs to be a higher level initiative.
Yeah, that basically is the next question, which was, Sinead, if you're in charge of fixing climate change, how would you do it? So you kind of jumped the gun on that one, so that's fine. So do you have anything you'd add on how to fix the world through climate change? How will algae save us, for example?
How will algae save us? Well, I mean, I think there is something to be said for looking for more efficient ways to deal with the population we have on the planet. So if we're going to have this many people on this tiny blue planet, we need to feed and clothe ourselves, feed, clothe, educate. We need to do everything more efficiently. So that does get down to the algae getting lower down on food chains and things like that. But again, I think these things are not going to happen at the speed we need them to happen by individuals taking action. I think there needs to be much higher level change. And this is, again, where I have my sort of moment of hope comes with what I saw happening with the big disruptive climate change marches before COVID kicked off. So I'm hoping that we return to that as soon as it's safe to do so.
Yeah. So my question now is to everyone.
Add
So,
something, Laura?
oh,
Sorry.
yes.
Yeah. Just to demonstrate my point, because I know I kind of just gave a lot of sort of high level reasons that could be seen as, you know, just my politics coming to the fore, which of course they are. But an example of what I mean by we can't just let the market solve this and we need some kind of state support or, you know, more collaboration between sectors is that there's a drug or a compound called eflornithine, and this was found quite some years ago to be an effective treatment for sleeping sickness. So when clinical trials were taking place in various parts of Africa, the problem was it was very expensive, and it was very expensive per patient. So even though it was showing, you know, to be something that could help a lot of people in a lot of their lives, it in the end was not something that was going to necessarily be easily supported. And what they found in the clinical trials was that one of the side effects was that it caused hair loss. And so rather than that being explored and this staying on as a treatment for sleeping sickness, what happened was Gillette found out about that side effect and ended up finding a use for eflornithine as a hair removal cream, and took on the patent for it and sold it at least in the States, and I think around the world. And for a while, it was not available as a sleeping sickness treatment. So I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, if you leave it to the market, the market will prevail. And if we're going to do, you know, effective pandemic preparedness, we need to go beyond that. And for me, that would require state or public intervention. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Nair basically got in the way.
Yeah.
Really horrible.
You can't even make it up, can you? So to all of you, would you go on the Atalanta and on to Cavendish? And what would your idea of utopia be?
I would go. I would be unable to not go, given the opportunity. And I know this about myself because when I said I went to the Antarctic once, that was also the first time I was ever on a ship. The collaborator I was working with, we had extra space, and she's like, would you like to come to Antarctica? And before she got her words out, I was like, yes, sign me up. So my very first trip on a big ship was for a month, where you were irretrievable on a really rough sea. So I like to think I'd be sensible enough to not go, but I would go. But I don't have any strong ideas on utopia other than this public intervention we keep saying. Like the more I look at the world out there, we've made this world for humans that doesn't work for almost all humans in it. So I would just like to live in a world that works for most of the humans that live in it, which I think will require us to be nice to the other things that live in it as well. But I'm becoming less prescriptive about how exactly I'd like it to be set up for humans, and just that it be set up for humans, please.
I agree. I don't know if I'd want to be on the first ship, but I think it would be pretty cool. I think the astrophysics of your book was really interesting, and how to get to Cavendish was well thought through. But as far as utopia goes, I absolutely agree with Sinead. You can't get a utopia. You try to get something where it's works well for most people. And I think my utopia right now on all of this and seeing what's going on in the world is that my utopia is that just people would be decent. They would be good to each other. They would be kind, and they would just be decent human beings. That's my utopia.
That's a good one.
I'd sign up for that.
Yeah, me too.
Would I go to to Cavendish. I think in our current world, or maybe even a pre-COVID world, I should say, I would be a hell no. I'm terrible at flying, so I'd be even worse on a shuttle. I would, in that first chapter, I could feel my pulse just like increasing and my blood pressure going up and going. Ah. I remember listening to Chris Hadfield's audiobook of his autobiography on your recommendation.
I love it so much.
Oh, I love it too. He's like, what did you say he was?
He's like a nice Canadian dad.
That you just, you're like,
that it's all going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just delightful.
But I remember him describing, all of it and just thinking, whoa, but I think if I was starting out in the world that your crew is heading from, which, it's not that far from ours in many ways, that maybe I'd be brave and would go. And yeah, I just agree with Sinead and Heidi. Just a world that is kinder and that works for more people, and we do away with some of the ideas that we have about individualism and meritocracy somehow being a level playing field.
Mm-hmm. That's a good note. So I'm going to go to some audience questions. So the first one I have is from Amy McCulloch. So question to scientists: has participating in the research stage of a science fiction novel changed how you look at science fiction novels / stories now? Or have you ever been frustrated at the depiction of your field in sci-fi stories / movies / novels?
This, I have to admit, was one of the first sci-fi books I've ever read.
Was Goldilocks.
And I was an astrophysicist, and this is, I mean, back in the 70s, you read some of the classics, but this was the first one in ages, and I got to tell you, I really, really enjoyed it very, very much. I really enjoyed it. I think I read The Martian. Does that count? And
Yeah,
that was phenomenal. And in this one, I really, really, I enjoyed it. When I got to tell you, when Liza told me about it, I'm like, what? This doesn't make any sense. And then when I read it, I was like, wow, this is great.
Yeah, I know the question I ask out of context, I think just sort of weirded you and John Charles out. Yeah. Like, why would you do this?
Right, exactly.
It wasn't on purpose, but now she has to deal with it. Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't know. I've always loved I love reading fiction, and I will read. I'm really not picky about my fiction, and science fiction is something I read with everything else. And I think I don't get too frustrated when I think the science in it is too slapdash. Except, okay, I had a hard time with Jurassic Park as an evolutionary biologist. I'm just going to put that out there. I mean, what I thought was really fun is, Laura and I have talked about this a few times, is that actually coming up with doing science, being a research scientist is not that different from being a writer, in that you're sort of thinking about, you have your idea of reality, or when I think about making projections on climate change, I have my idea of reality, and then I come up with a slightly different take on it, and then I plan experiments to better elucidate what it really is, right? So I'm sort of proposing narratives and then testing them. And the way I see it, a good sci-fi novel is proposing an alternate narrative, and the test is whether or not the reader will make that leap of faith, make that leap with you and go. But I didn't find it that different than planning experiments or doing experiments. And I was ready by the time I finished talking to Laura to pack up my algae and go to NASA. I was ready.
NASA would be a boon for NASA to have you.
No, they just.
I think as someone on both sides of the writing side, the fiction side, and the sort of academic research side, I'm not picky with the genres I read, and if it does have that credibility and that internal logic, I'm prepared to take any kind of leap of faith and believe that consistently. But I think it's when things they slip on their own internal logic that they lose me. And Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Some internal logic issues. I mean, I think in terms of things that I like about my field in sci-fi, possibly don't watch it now if you're going to feel triggered by it. But in terms of like a half decent Hollywood film about pandemics, you know, don't watch Outbreak, watch Contagion.
Yeah. Contagion was pretty good. I rewatched it on your recommendation. I was like, yeah, that's pretty much how this all played out. There are some bits there where you're like, wow, that's pretty real.
Yeah.
Massive trigger warnings right now.
Let's see, what else do I have here? So if you were to take one thing with you on the ship to Cavendish, what would it be?
So based on what I take into field work, you know, if you could take one thing after you finish packing all your equipment, what do you slip into that equipment box? I would take a book. Even if I could only take one book, I would take it. I took one of Patti Smith's books with me to the Antarctic. It was the only real book I took, and I did not for a moment regret that decision. And I think if you have a good book or a good piece of music, you can play it on repeat for a long time.
Yeah, or you could cheat and pack a Kindle.
Or you could, you know, trade with every other scientist on the boat who also has brought books, right? But, you know, I mean, I would take a library. We can extend the size of the object if you would like.
Toby O'Neill says, my daughter says she would take her hamster. Not sure that would be allowed.
We've seen that hamster. I love the hamster. I've been watching it jump around on you during the...
Oh, I see the hamster. How cute.
I had an attending physician who, when I was a resident, who always said that in our coat pockets, in our lab coat pockets, which are full of cheat sheets and stethoscopes and beepers, that we should always have no less than 3 and no more than 5 photographs of our family.
Aw, that's nice.
So I always have my 4 photographs of my family in my pocket at all times. And they obviously would have to come with me to Cavendish. They keep you grounded.
Yeah, for sure. What about you, Peta?
If I have to limit it to one, I'd find it hard to limit to one book. So possibly even just a journal, like something to write in, so that I could tell when I'd hit that, you know, lull stage of the the expedition. I think things sound really logical and, you know, really well thought through in my brain at that particular stage. And if I write them out and then sort of read them the next day, I can be like, girl. So, you know, maybe it's part of the way I'd keep at least closer to sane and together.
I like Kat Lawson's comment just now, snacks.
Yeah, snacks are important.
Because those algae cubes tend to not...
Oh God, yeah, the algae cubes. No one wants to eat the algae cubes. You'll surely read the book. No one wants the NutriBlocks.
When I was down at NASA in January at the Human Research Project meetings, essentially that was what was being described in the nutrition lectures. I went to one of the nutrition lectures and they said, what are you gonna have? Because there's no space in space. You're in a very small environment, and how are you're gonna be able to grow a little food hydroponically, but you have to have a lot of power-packed foods. And so they had created, and something that's going to be able to last 3 years without losing its nutritional value, so that they had taken some real power foods, high in protein, high in antioxidants, things that are healthy for you, and squished them down into essentially the algae.
I was right. Algae cubes. I'm so proud. I predicted the future.
Well, they kept them for 3 years and made people eat them, so it was very interesting.
Well, I have to admit that when I go on long field trips, I take with me at the beginning a shoebox of chocolate, and during the lull, I deploy it both as snacks and as currency.
Smart. Black market.
Yeah.
Sinead makes really good chocolate. She makes it from scratch. She's going to give me chocolate, she said.
Laura reminds me. Yeah, that was guilt tripping me in front of witnesses.
All right, so we are at 7, so I'm going to have to start winding down. But real quick, do you guys have any questions for me about writing and integrating science or anything? I don't know if you do or not, just in case. No?
It must be difficult because you say you aren't a scientist, and that puts a lot of faith in us and what you're writing down. And I did notice that there, in one aspect of the book, there was literally a paragraph of an email that went between us.
Yeah, I was just like, that sounds good. You have to hope for the
I was
best.
like, nailed it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I do trust the experts. So, you know, there's no way I can be like, well, that doesn't sound right. So I think it's mostly doing enough research to get the general ballpark. Like I could Google what will they eat in space and come across algae. And then knowing what to ask people is important. So I needed to know, you know, what can make algae fail? So then it's very stressful if on the ship suddenly their food/oxygen source is on the fritz. And then I learned about cyanophages through that, which are viruses that attack algae. And then I was like, Sinead, how can you fix the algae? And I had like a way to fix it that I'd cobbled together, but then
Sinead, very complicated way to fix it.
But you found a beautiful way to fix it that even tied into the thematic architecture of my book of spontaneous resistance.
Well, I mean, you described to me a situation that I've seen so many mornings in my own lab, which is that you walk in and everything is dying and you're like, no, please say it isn't true. Like, and when I read the visual of the contaminated algae, I felt a little moment of panic.
Yay. Yeah, I think like I trust the experts not to steer me wrong, but it's knowing what to ask within the larger context of the story is probably the main challenge. But yeah, I'm really grateful that I do have a network of figuring out what to ask and who to ask, or if they don't know, they know someone who does. And I think too that like I'm really happy with the generosity of scientists, and I think scientists are also really excited to be like, you're interested in my thing. You're going to like bring it to the masses because they're probably not going to read my peer review academic journal articles. I know, even though I'm sure they're riveting.
They're riveting.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that brings us, we're almost 10 past. So I just want to thank Chimera Festival for hosting. And I want to plug a couple of workshops that are happening next month at the Digital Chimera Festival. So me and Peta are running a writing workshop on mental resilience and innovation in writing, and how do you keep going when everything falls apart and unexpected plot twists make you want to give up and become a goat farmer in the middle of nowhere. So we give you tips and tricks.
Yoga teacher. Great yoga.
And then me and a former student on my master's, Katie, we're running a workshop on climate change as well, which I'm tempted to be like, Sinead, come join our workshop, which you probably would if I asked nicely. So we may grab you on that. And then me and Sinead are also planning to maybe do some interesting science outreach over the next few months. So keep an eye out for that. We want to try and get people to stay motivated to change things as things ramp up again. And I will probably also ask Peta and Heidi to help if they want as well. But yeah, so thank you so much to everyone for tuning in and giving up your morning/afternoon/evening, whatever time of day it is. And obviously, if you have not yet picked up a copy of Goldilocks, please, please, please buy it. Pretty, 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 pretty please. So, and if you have read it, please leave a review. So I think that is everything. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.